Thank you, Lane, for bringing up my dear friend Grady. She's alive and well in Birmingham and views Donald Trump as a proof of her theory that you got to watch out for mean white people. I'm going to bring this chair over here so I can put this on it, if that's okay. Between the time I joined the Birmingham Post-Herald in 1964 and I left the New York Times in 2003, I lived through what I now see as the last golden age of American print newspapers. None can predict what will replace the great dailies and whether the ideal of public service they served will be honored by our electronic successors. So this seems a good time to pause and look over our shoulders at a major theme of that newspaper era, which was a drive by a few visionary editors to improve the quality of newspaper writing, to make it more literate and, if you will, more literary without compromising its informational integrity. Today I want to talk about three of those visionary editors with whom I worked and what they represented. Two were nationally famous, and a third was evangelist of good writing who spent his life in regional newspapers in Alabama and Georgia. Significantly, all three entered the profession shortly before or after World War II. As members of the post-war generation, they sensed, independently of one another, that the post-war newspaper readers were going to be better educated, more affluent, and more expansive in their worldview. More expansive in their worldviews. Two of the three were Pulitzer winners, and the third, a mentor in the newsroom to several Pulitzer winners. Let me introduce them in the order in which they came into my newspaper life. All have gone on to the big newsroom, but I want to share my memories of them. Clark Stallworth was city editor of the Birmingham Post-Herald and managing editor of the Birmingham News. Gene Patterson, editor of the Atlanta Constitution and St. Petersburg Times, whose work I was honored to read last night at this amazing event we've all experienced. And A.M. Rosenthal, executive editor of the New York Times. Like Roy Peter Clark, Stallworth was a pioneer newsroom writing coach. When I went to work for him at the Birmingham Post-Herald, I could not type. When I left his newsroom 9 months later, I had the basic tools of a reporting career. Clark once said that the best journalism school in Alabama was not in Tuscaloosa or Auburn, but in the Birmingham Post-Herald newsroom. And there was a lot to be said for his theory there, I think. From my first day on the paper, Clark pushed me and other novice reporters to avoid writing the simplified journalese of that era. He had me look up in the morgue a story which he had won the Alabama equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, which was the annual AP Sweepstakes Award for the best single newspaper story of the year, and the prize was $50. And it was a marvelous story. And he had stylistic flourishes that I now see anticipated the new journalism. He described the murderous sheriff of Alabama's sin capital, Phoenix City, and drew a picture of a man who wore two pearl-handled pistols on the street every day and allegedly used one of them to kill the crusading district attorney who threatened his gambling and prostitution income. When I praised the story's style, which frankly filled me with envy, Clark thanked me and said he worried about whether his colorful writing had unfairly depicted the murderer. Whatever he had done, he said, he is a human being. I think Clark was overly hard on himself. He was a man of very sensitive conscience, but two lessons emerged from that I'll not belabor. Make it sing, make it accurate. What Clark had in common with Gene and Abe was that he understood that giving the subscriber a richer reading experience was a goal that could coexist with traditional journalistic standards of factuality and fairness. Flash forward to 1977 when Roy, Peter Clark, and I arrived at the St. Petersburg Times as draftees in Gene Patterson's writing school. I like to think that Gene saw a spark in us that made us candidates to reach for the storytelling torch that he had been handed by Ralph McGill. One of the glories of the golden era was its each one teach one tradition. Roy found his life's work in Gene's newsroom, and I found the freedom after 15 years in the newspaper business to write the kind of political stories that put the needs of the literate reader ahead of the wishes and feelings of whatever snake or saint was in the political news of that day. I remember the moment when Gene let me know that I had found my métier and my mentor. I like it when you spin the hoop, he said one Monday morning. Meaning he wanted reporting in the St. Pete Times that had narrative sweep. And I think he went to his rest having accomplished that goal, and I'm so happy that his tradition continues. Gene represented the ascendancy of a generation of newspaper editors and publishers who would change the way American newspapers were written and presented. The group included Otis Chandler, the LA Times, Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, Tom Winship with the Boston Globe, and the sacred monster who hired me at the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal. They were hard-charging, old-school newspaper men who competed against one another to find writers who could oxygenate newspaper prose. I'm pausing to try to bring Abe back to mind. It still scares me. I'll sum up his complex genius by saying he understood that the good gray lady couldn't stay great if it stayed gray. As with Gene, I remember a signature sentence that he spoke to me. It was on the day I was hired, and he said he was hiring me because I wrote with flair. But, he said, to be a marquee writer at the Times, one had to understand that style could never overrule substance and intellectual honesty, and he explained to me how he enforced that rule. He gestured toward the newsroom and beyond his ornate Japanese-themed office. He was a man who liked grandeur. And he said, people out there say I'm a maniac, and I am. I am a maniac for the New York Times. And I feel so lucky to have known all three of those men. Each of them were great teachers in their very distinctive ways. I could drill down, I guess, and, okay, 2 minutes, give an exegesis of what each of them did, but I think their joint accomplishment was enshrining the notion that sophistication and literacy had to be honored if we wanted to appeal to the modern reader. I've called it a golden era. It was not just a metaphor. It was an era of financial prosperity that brought forth an expanding playing field on which reporters, editorialists, and columnists could more fully explore their talents to the benefit of the engaged reader. Gold was not just a metaphor of the era. Newspapers were cash cows in those days, a secret carefully protected by the newspaper chains that arose in that era. I wish I could tell you that the value placed on good writing by the great editors will be carried into the digital world, where the economics are very different. I can't promise that because the kind of handmade journalism these men espoused was labor intensive and extremely expensive to produce. And frankly, we don't yet know whether today's readers will pay for the kind of writing that could be sold profitably in those days to both readers and advertisers. Unlike many of my ink-stained generation, I don't condemn the informational and stylistic future that is now congealing before us. Since the days of clay tablets and the stylus, mechanical processes have shaped how we write. All I'm saying is that the apex of the typewriter era was a glorious thing, and I feel so lucky to have been part of it. Thank you.